The Holy Gospels are reading from St. Matthew, the 17th chapter. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and his brother John, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And Jesus was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. And suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with them. And then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And while he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." And when the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. And you may be seated. Well, I love baptisms. I just want you to know that. I love babies, so I love baptisms. And I hope that you love baptisms as well. There's so much truth when we baptize a child, and that truth is just so evident in what we do as people of faith, or shall I say, what God does during a baptism. I mean, baptism really is a visual sermon. I wouldn't even need to preach when there are baptisms, but I wouldn't need to, but I'm going to. Everything we need to know about the Christian life and faith is found in our baptisms. I mean, there's so much of that truth right in front of us. First, there is this person being baptized. There is this infant, there is this child, there is this baby. It could be an adolescent, it could be a teenager, it could be an adult, it could be anyone, but whoever that is, whatever age, whatever we know or whatever we don't know about this person is receiving something from God. There is a gift that comes to this person from God. There is this promise that comes to this person from God, this promise of God's everlasting life, God's promise of God's commitment to that person, to be with that person through the whole of their lives. And so I love baptisms. I hope that you love baptisms as well. There's that sense of receiving something from God, receiving something that's totally free, that's totally unearned. It's an unearned gift. And so whenever I witness a baptism, whenever I get to be around a baptism, we have this God that just shows up and offers God's promise and God's commitment. And that's the greatest sermon right there that anybody could ever preach. But then there's a part where we make the sign of the cross on the one who is baptized. We make the sign of the cross on their forehead, and we say to them, "You are marked by the cross of Christ, not just this day, not just tomorrow, but you are marked with the cross of Christ forever." How long is forever? How long is forever? Forever, right? That's a long time. You are marked with the cross of Christ forever. And then the person receives this candle with the instructions, "Let your light so shine." And then we welcome that person into our fellowship, into the family of faith. And then we have these children that come forward, and we see what kind of family we are. And we say these words, "We welcome you into the body of Christ and into the mission we share, joining us in giving thanks and praise to God in bearing God's creative and redeeming word to all the world." Creative and redeeming. These are the two words that describe the mission of God. The mission of God is creative. The mission of God is redeeming. God has a mission in the world, and everyone who is baptized receives both this promise and this mission. We bear God's creative and redeeming word to the world. So it's creative and it's redeeming. That's why I love baptisms. I hope that you love baptisms as well. Such a visual sign of God's grace and unearned love. Such a sign of our mission that we share in the world. Sharing this light that really doesn't come from us, we get to share it, but it's a light that comes from Christ. It's the light of Christ that we share, the light of the world that we share. That's the promise, that's the mission. It's creative and it's redeeming, and it's light. It's light in dark places. That's what Peter and James and John found when they went up the mountain with Jesus. They saw this light, this very light of Christ. And they were filled with awe. They were filled with this inspiration. They were awful disciples. They were filled with awe, awful. And we think about that. God showed up in that awe. That's what the Transfiguration is really about. It's about God showing up in the light of Christ. They went up the mountain and there was God. God showed up. That's what happened in the story that we have today. God showed up. God showed up in Jesus in such a way that his presence was unmistakable to these three disciples. God showed up in the thundering light and the words that were spoken. And it was a glimpse of this glory. It was the light of the glory of God that stayed with them through the rest of their lives. A story that they would tell generations of people later. They would tell the story about this blinding light, about Moses and Elijah appearing to them on the mountain. They would tell the story, and as they would tell the story, God would show up there too when they told the story. God would show up like a lamp shining in dark places. God showed up and filled them with this awe. Awe is really a religious term. We don't use it as a religious term. I mean, we use the word awesome too much these days. I mean, if you have a good pizza, we say, well, it's awesome, If we go to a good ball game or a good wrestling match, what do we say? Well, that was awesome. We use the term so much that we've kind of lost its meaning. But awe is really a religious word. Awe is a religious word. Originally, the term referred to a reverent wonder and amazement that was so wonderful that it made you afraid. It dropped you to your knees. To feel awe is to encounter that which is unexpected, that which is beyond your normal experience. It is that which is beyond your control. And it is that experience that makes you feel the very presence of God in your life. That is the only thing that is awesome or awe-filled. It is knowing that God is near. It is knowing that God shows up in your life. And so you can find awe when you contemplate the vastness of the oceans. You can feel awe when you look at the great heights of mountains or the mountain peaks, or you can feel awe when you experience the great expanse of the stars. You can encounter awe when you consider the 10 little fingers and 10 little toes of a baby. And maybe that's why I love baptisms, because it gives us an experience of this awe that nothing else really can. This is the awe that we have when we baptize children. This awe, Matthew notes, this light that is shining is something that can be overwhelming. It can be overwhelming. When we consider the 10 little fingers and toes of a child, and we consider that we as parents are placed in a position of caring for this infant now, that can oftentimes feel overwhelming. I mean, what a great gift, but it can be overwhelming. That awe can bring a sense that we are overwhelmed now in the love and the care that we are supposed to give to this child. And you see in the text today, the disciples, they have this balance, this delicate balance between this being filled with awe and this being overwhelmed by the task that is before them. And we have this great story that Matthew tells, this great sermon that Matthew gives us. And so as the disciples are filled with awe and amazement, they literally fall upon their knees. They are overwhelmed. And Matthew tells us that Jesus comes to the disciples. Jesus comes to them and Jesus places his hand on them. He touches them and he says to them, "Get up. Do not be afraid." This is an awe-filled experience for you. You may be overwhelmed in life, but Jesus comes and Jesus places his hand on their shoulder, on the disciples' shoulder. He places his hands on their shoulder and he says to them, "You may be overwhelmed, but rise up. Get up and do not be afraid." Do not be afraid. There is embedded in the story of the Transfiguration something of that detail of us being overwhelmed at times and being filled with awe at times in our lives. And Jesus came to the disciples and touched them. And Jesus comes to us and touches us and tells us the same. Life can be overwhelming. Life was overwhelming for the disciples of old. Do you think it's going to be any different for the disciples of today? Life will be overwhelming. The tasks, the things that God calls us to do will be overwhelming for us at times. The burdens that we place on ourselves, the pressures that we give ourselves, the pressures that maybe others place upon us, the deadlines, the responsibilities of our jobs, the things that we try to accomplish in our lives can be overwhelming. But Jesus comes to us and he touches us and he tells us, "Rise up." Even when we don't know where our future will bring us or take us, Jesus comes to us and touches us and says, "Rise up, get up." Even if you don't know about your future, rise up and do not be afraid. Rise up, people of God. Rise up and do not be afraid. God will show up in your life and will give you that encouragement and that hope so life does not overwhelm you. And not only does God show up to give us encouragement, do you know that God shows up in us? And that's why I love baptism so much. Because God shows up in our lives. I want you to look at your hands. Just take your hands out. Take your hands out and look at your hands. Hold your hands up and look at them. Do you know that God shows up in your hands? Look at your hands. Those are holy hands. God's work shows up in the hands that you do, in the ways in which you love others and the way in which you bless others. You have holy hands. God shows up in the work that you do. Remember, we are to bear God's creative and redeeming word to the world. You use your hands to do that, to bear God's creative and redeeming word to the world. So you have holy hands. God shows up in your hands. I want you to just take your hands out and hold your hands up like this, because they're holy hands. You have holy hands. I mean, it's almost like you're being arrested, right? It feels like, my hands up, I'm being arrested. And you know what? That's why I love baptisms, because you are being arrested. Your life is being arrested. Keep your hands up. Your lives are being arrested by the Holy Spirit. You have holy hands. You are to bear God's creative and redeeming word to all the world. Now turn to your neighbor. Turn to your neighbor and mark those hands with the cross. Just make the sign of the cross on those hands. Mark those cross and say to that person, "Blessed are your hands." Blessed are your hands. Say that to your neighbor. Blessed are your hands. Blessed are your hands. Blessed are your hands, family of faith. You awful family of faith. You are an awe-filled family of faith. Blessed be the work